Professor Daniel Hargrove stood at the podium in the University of New Hampshire auditorium, his tone brimming with confidence. "It's time to move past the myths," he declared. "Religion has held humanity back for centuries, and one of the biggest stories still dominating so many lives is Jesus. Let's be clear, Jesus is just a fairy tale." The students sat in silence, some nodding, others quietly taking notes. Karoline Leavitt, 27, the youngest White House press secretary in history, was on campus as a guest speaker, addressing Gen Z's role in politics. Bringing both her Catholic faith and sharp Washington demeanor, she walked through the hallway when the professor's words reached her ears. She stopped, her hand clenching. Having faced the pressures of the White House, she was no stranger to controversy. But calling Jesus, a foundation of her faith and values, a fairy tale, that was something she couldn't let stand. The lecture hall buzzed as Professor Hargrove continued. A renowned progressive scholar, he braced his hands on the podium, his sharp gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Look at the facts," he said, his voice low but cutting. "The story of Jesus Christ, a man said to walk on water, turn water into wine, rise from the dead, is no different from Greek mythology or Viking legends. There is no reliable historical evidence confirming he existed as the Bible claims. It's all a product of imagination, woven to control the masses for centuries." Some students nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. A girl in the front row scribbled notes, while a guy in the back discreetly scrolled through his phone. Hargrove smirked, relishing the attention. "I know this is hard for some of you to hear," he continued, "but it's time to grow up and leave childish stories behind. Science and reason are the only paths to progress. Religion, especially the Jesus myth, is just baggage from the past." He paused, as if expecting applause. Instead, the door clicked open. Karoline Leavitt stood at the entrance, her petite yet commanding presence in a deep blue suit. The room stirred. "Who's that?" one student whispered. "Isn't she from the White House?" another murmured. Hargrove frowned, clearly displeased by the interruption. Karoline stepped forward, her heels clicking on the wooden floor like a silent challenge. She stopped in the aisle, her eyes locked onto the professor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm, carrying through the room. "I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just heard you say Jesus is a fairy tale, and I have to say, you're wrong." A hush fell over the auditorium. Hargrove raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Oh? And who might you be?" he asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "I didn't expect a politician to care about my history class. Are you here to defend this myth?" Karoline didn't flinch. She stepped closer, standing just feet from Hargrove, arms crossed, a stance of a press secretary used to facing a tough press corps. "I'm not here to defend a myth," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. "I'm here to defend the truth. You say there's no evidence for Jesus, then how do you explain Tacitus, a non-Christian Roman historian who recorded Jesus's execution under Pontius Pilate? Or Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian who mentioned Jesus as a real figure with major influence? These aren't biblical sources. These are independent historical records." The students whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to fact-check her claim. Hargrove crossed his arms, his smirk intact. "Leavitt, right," he said coolly. "You might be a good mouthpiece for Trump, but don't bring your political games into my classroom. Those sources, if they are even real, are just fragmented anecdotes written decades after the fact. They prove nothing beyond someone telling a good story." Karoline tilted her head, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "A good story," she repeated, her voice edged with sarcasm. "Then why did that story change the world? Why have billions across centuries lived and died for it? You can call it a fairy tale, but you can't deny Jesus's impact, historical or religious. Take your pick." Dismissing him entirely isn't science, it's arrogance. A single clap broke the silence. Then the student stopped, eyes darting to Hargrove. The professor's lips twitched, clearly prepared for pushback. "Who do you think you are, Miss Leavitt?" he asked, his voice hardening. "A theologian? A historian? Or just a mouthpiece for outdated ideas?" Karoline smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Her presence commanded the room. Across from her, Professor Daniel Hargrove, a well-known progressive scholar, gripped the edge of the lectern, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. The air was thick with tension. "You think a few scraps from Tacitus and Josephus are enough to make me bow to your Jesus?" Hargrove scoffed. "Ridiculous. You walk into my class with confidence, but your politics and superstitions blind you." Karoline tilted her head, a faint smile crossing her lips, one devoid of friendliness. "Blinded," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "No, Professor. I'm standing here because I see the truth. One you refuse to accept." She took a step forward, her words firm yet calm. "I don't need to be your student to recognize that dismissing anything outside your rational box is a mistake. I was raised in a Catholic family in New Hampshire. I learned to question, to dig deep, because I don't settle for easy answers. And now I'm here, not for politics, not for superstition, but for the truth. History has proven it." The room fell silent. Hargrove let out a dry laugh, but it lacked the confidence his reputation carried. "Your truth," he sneered. "It's just a story spun by a fanatic mob, used by people like Trump to manipulate emotions. Influence isn't proof of existence. Hitler influenced the world too, does that make him a god?" Karoline's eyes blazed. She stepped closer. "Don't compare Jesus to Hitler," she said, her voice like steel. "That's a cheap trick, and you know it. Jesus taught love and forgiveness. Hitler brought death and destruction. If you want to talk about influence, look at the laws, the morals, the very society we live in. Where do those values come from? His teachings. A real person, not a fiction. You don't have to believe he was the Son of God, but don't pretend he didn't leave a mark deeper than anyone else in history." The room stirred. A female student hesitantly raised her hand. "If there are historical records mentioning Jesus, doesn't that prove he was real?" Another voice chimed in. "Yeah. Tacitus wasn't a Christian. Why would he make it up?" Hargrove's face darkened. "Those documents aren't reliable," he snapped. "They were written too late, possibly forged, or just rumors. You want to believe rumors? That's not science. That's naivete." He turned back to Karoline, his voice dripping with disdain. "And you prey on that naivete, just like in the White House." "I expected better." Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped onto the podium, leveling herself with him. "Expected," she echoed. "You expect everyone to just agree with you. To dismiss anything that doesn't suit your worldview. I'm not naive, Professor. I've learned from life. And life taught me that truth isn't just found in books." She paused, then added with quiet intensity, "I grew up playing softball. I know how to balance reason and heart. And I know how to recognize truth." Hargrove stepped back slightly, caught off guard by her fire. "You think your personal story makes you right," he growled. "I don't care how you grew up. I care about evidence." Karoline smiled, a victorious, knowing smile. "You want evidence?" she asked. "Look at history. Without Jesus, do you think we'd have hospitals? Schools? The concept of human rights. They didn't just appear. They came from his teachings. You can dismiss them as anecdotes, but I call them the foundation of our world." The students erupted in applause. Some shouted in agreement. A guy in the back raised his phone. I just looked it up, Tacitus is real. Hargrove's fists clenched. He wasn't used to losing ground, especially to an outsider. You're good, he admitted, his voice bitter. But don't expect me to buy into this performance. You might fool them, but you won't fool me. Karoline met his gaze, fearless. I don't need to fool anyone, she replied. The truth speaks for itself. The auditorium buzzed with energy. Students whispered. Some stood to cheer. Hargrove, for the first time, hesitated. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, Karoline's argument, or the way the students were responding. Karoline let the silence hang for a moment before addressing the crowd. I'm not here to force you to believe Jesus was the Son of God, she said, scanning their faces. That's your choice. But dismissing him entirely. Calling him a fairy tale. That's dishonest. Science doesn't explain everything about humanity. History isn't just data, it's people. It's ideas. Jesus was real. And he matters. A male student in the back raised his hand. But if science can't prove miracles, why do you still believe? Karoline smiled. Good question, she replied. I believe because I see the power in his teachings, love, forgiveness, sacrifice. I grew up with them. I live them every day. Miracles. That's up to you. But don't let anyone tell you he didn't exist just because we can't measure everything. Hargrove looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. A memory stirred, his younger days, when he read religious texts to understand, not just to disprove. When had he changed? When had he decided that reason alone was enough? The students grew lively. I agree with her, a girl in the front row declared. If Jesus wasn't real, why did the whole world change because of him? Another student hesitated. But influence alone isn't proof. Hitler had influence too. Karoline turned to him, eyes stern. Don't repeat that cheap comparison, she said. Hitler destroyed. Jesus built. His influence is the foundation of the best in us. That's the difference. For once, Hargrove had no immediate retort. He stepped aside, gripping the desk as if needing support. Am I really being honest? He wondered. He looked at her, voice quieter. You say science doesn't explain everything. But if we don't rely on science, what do we rely on? Emotion. Faith. Karoline met his gaze. I want them to think for themselves, she said, gesturing to the students. Science is a tool. A great one. But it's not everything. Faith, history, emotion, they are part of being human too. Jesus doesn't need a test tube to prove he was real. He proved it through what he left behind. The students roared with applause. Hargrove stood there, silent, his hand trembling slightly. Have I been too rigid? He wondered. The debate wasn't just another classroom discussion. It was a turning point. As Karoline left campus, her phone buzzed, TikTok notifications flooding in, the hashtag Karoline wins spreading fast. Meanwhile, Hargrove sat in his office, staring at an old book, Tacitus' writings. His arrogance from that morning had faded. For the first time in years, he picked up his pen and scribbled a note, question like she did. Maybe, just maybe, he had something to learn. The takeaway. Karoline Leavitt's debate reflects the tension in today's America, between faith and reason, tradition and modernity. In an age where social media spreads ideas in seconds, her willingness to stand up for her beliefs sparked something bigger than a classroom argument. Her story is a lesson. Conviction and openness can coexist. Standing for truth doesn't require arrogance, just courage.